Good evening. Welcome to Artist Talk on Art on Monday, March 21st, 2022 at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm Doug Shear, president of ATOA. Tonight, we feature a legacy series recording from our archive held February 6, 1998, and featuring a dialogue between the then ATOA executive director, Vernita Nemec, and the then MoMA senior curator of painting and sculpture, Robb Storr. This is a copyrighted program and a part of the ATOA archive held at Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. All rights are reserved. There will be no Q&A period tonight because it's a legacy screening. By the way, I should say, you note that we charge no admission fees, we charge no fees. So please consider making a donation to ATOA. To do that, just go to our website, which is atoanyc.org, and click on Contribute. Vernita Nemec was born in 1942 in Painesville, Ohio. She's also known by the performance name Vernita Incognita, and is both a visual artist and a performance artist, a curator, and an arts activist based in New York City. She earned her BFA at Ohio University in 1964 and has resided in New York City since 1965. She's also known for her soft sculpture, collages, artist books, photographs, and installations. She adopted the pseudonym Incognita, a pun on incognito, as a way to honor artists who have not become well known. Her multifaceted career in art making, curating, and art activism began in 1969 at Museum, a project for living artists. That year, with Carolyn Mazzello, she originated and contributed to X12, one of the first exhibitions to feature only women artists. In the early 1970s, she was a member of the Art Workers Coalition and Women Artists in Revolution, or WAR, along with Nancy Sparrow, Leon Golub, Cindy Nemzer, and Lucy Lepard. She also wrote for the feminist art periodical Women Art. Nemec worked with other arts activist groups, including Art Against Apartheid and Political Art Documentation and Distribution, or PAD. She became an artist member of Soho 20 in 1975. In 1978, Nemec, Barnaby Rue, and Bill Rabinovich organized the Whitney Counterweight, an exhibition that protested the elitism of the Whitney Biennial. In subsequent years, Nemec shifted her activism to helping artists. From 1989 to 1999, she was president and executive director of Artist Talk on Art. In 1999, she became a part-time director of Viridian Artists, an artist-owned gallery in Chelsea. Robb Storr was from 1990 to 2002 a curator and then senior curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art. As a curator, Storr established himself with a number of major exhibitions at the museum and elsewhere, which enhanced the public prominence of such artists as Elizabeth Murray, who happens to have appeared at ATOA, Gerhard Richter, Max Beckmann, Tony Smith, and Robert Ryman. He also organized a number of reinstallations of MoMA's permanent collection, covering such topics as abstraction and the modern grotesque. From 2002 to 2006, he was the first Rosalie Salo Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Art, NYU. According to New York Magazine, he is considered to be one of the most influential Americans in the art world. Over the years, he has written for many art publications, including Art in America, Art Forum, The Washington Post, Village Voice, The Brooklyn Rail, and Interview. He was the first American director of visual arts of the Venice Biennale in 2007. He has taught at the CUNY Graduate Center and the Bard Center for Curatorial Studies, as well as the Rhode Island School of Design, Tyler School of Art, New York Studio School, and Harvard University. He was appointed Dean of the Yale School of Art, and that was renewed for a second term, which began in July of 2011. After completing his second term, he continued to teach at Yale as a tenured professor in the Department of Painting and Printmaking. He retired in June 2021 and resides in New Haven. And now we'll play the 1998 dialogue.
For coming. This is going to be a wonderful night, and I have a couple of announcements. One of them is we wish to thank the Phoenix Gallery once again for lending this marvelous space to us, and it's a wonderful show. I hope you enjoy it. I do. And let's see. Our contest is coming up, Curator's Choice. Please pick up a flyer. It's a slide competition which will be judged by dealer Maxwell Davison. And the winners will have, there'll be 3 to 6 winners, and they will have an evening here, May 1st, in discussion with Maxwell and show their work. It's a wonderful opportunity, and everybody, for every $5, it's a benefit for us, and for every $5 spent for the slide competition, up to 5 slides, the artist gets a free ticket for the evening. So, I mean, you win, in all ways you win. Now, I got to tell you about next week because it's my panel on erotic art. Doug's in mine, but he didn't do as much as I did, so I put my name first. Anyhow, but it was his idea. It's going to be about how blurry the lines are between sex and art and sex and the aesthetics, the question of the aesthetics, and the lines are getting even blurrier in the past couple of weeks, if you may have noticed. And sex and politics and art are getting all mixed up. And so it should be a very interesting evening. We'll have Barbara Alper, who is a photographer of the underground sex scene. We'll have, what are you doing, Flash? I'm getting feedback here. And Renee Yatava, who is a well-known wild man of the arts, and Candida Royale, who is an erotic feminist filmmaker, and she lent me a tape, or she gave me a tape, and I gotta say, it's art, folks, and something else. So, and Mark Stevens will be kind of the conscience of the evening, and I'll be the old lady, you know, kind of the crone observing it all. So it should be a wonderful evening. And now let's get started. I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but that's my style. Yes, oh, Hope has, oh yeah, okay.
I'm Hope Carter. I'm Vice President of the Gallery, and I just want to say how pleased we are to have ATOA each Friday. We are a co-op gallery, and we often have openings for membership if anyone is interested in applying. We also, as well as being a co-op gallery, we are a nonprofit organization, and we give out space. The small space in here is available. We like to have shows of social, cultural, environmental relevance. It can be a curated show or an individual artist, and once or twice a year we do use one of the larger gallery spaces, usually for a curated show. So if anyone is interested, please apply. I think that's it. Oh, and I'm asking, please, please be careful of the artwork. My artwork is in the back, and the Post-Archaeological Society is here in this room. It's been kind of scattered, but it's a very interesting show. Thank you.
We let her say anything she wants. She's a landlady, and since the rent is free, the price is right. Anyhow, most of you know Vernita. If you don't, Where have you been? Vernita Incognita, AKA Nemec. And Vernita was executive director for 10 years before they found a sucker.
I was waiting for you.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Very patiently, I might add. And she's a wonderful, as well as being an administrator and an independent curator. She's been putting on shows based environmental shows based on the use of detritus. Nobody knows trash better than this woman. And she's, in her own right, she's a very talented visual artist and performance artist. She's just back from Arizona, where she did a performance of Bohemian Barbie, which is Barbie at 80, right? Geriatric Barbie. Think on it. I find it a very appealing idea, actually. And now for Vernita.
In fact, I was going to invite you to be in the next version.
Oh, thank you, darling.
Okay.
You sure I'm not too young? Anyhow, she's going to introduce our very distinguished guest. I'll get it out. Robb Storr.
I just want to say that it's truly an honor to have Robb Storr with us this evening because his schedule is unbelievable. I don't know if you saw in the New York Times last week, but he's upcoming. He has a host of interviews of artists at the 92nd Street Y, so give them a call. I think maybe next week you have one, in fact.
With Matthew Barney.
Yeah, Matthew Barney starting out with, and a lot of other interesting as well as controversial people, I think. His one-page bio says it best, but I forgot it, so I'm going to, I did make some notes, however, and what I could ascertain is that he's been at the MoMA since 1991. He's curated 18 exhibitions there. The first was entitled Dislocations, and it was a show of installations by Louise Bourgeois, Chris Burden, Sophie Cale, David Hammonds, Ilya Kobakoff, Bruce Nauman, and Adrian Piper. He's published articles and book reviews in Art in America since 1983 until the early 90s, which I guess was replaced by the MoMA. Perhaps, we'll hear more later. Plus reviews and articles and other publications such as the New Art Examiner, the Art Journal, Meaning, and Parquet. 2, he's also been a visiting artist at nearly 20 universities and art schools and has taught at 15 of them. There are 7 pages listing panels and lectures. Are there any of those people that you want to talk about?
Ask me.
In the narrative version of your bio, it says that you've written on the problems of public art, criticism, and the global art community. Can you talk a bit about your concerns and where you come from philosophically as a start?
Okay, 2 minor details first, and then I'll do that.
Yeah.
The first is that I haven't done 18 shows. I've done fewer than that, plenty, but fewer than that. Secondly, if Barbie's close to 80, the Demoiselles d'Avignon are verging on 91 or 2. So it'd be an interesting show to get Barbie and the Demoiselles d'Avignon together. Anyway.
We'll talk about it later.
The global situation. First of all, my perceptions of what modern art have to do with circumstances and ideas and methods of art making, which are in fact global, not because of new technologies, not because of international markets, but because ideals travel from intelligent people to intelligent people and from creative people to creative people, and that modernism, virtually from its inception, was a global phenomenon. The size of the communities in various places varied. The histories vary enormously. The degree of permission and tolerance and actual welcome vary enormously. But modernism was, from the get-go, a global phenomenon. And what I'm involved in and what my colleagues are involved in is dealing with a museum which is not a museum of modern art, Europe and American, certainly not a museum of modern art in New York, but a museum which, as of the time that Alfred Barr founded it, was a museum which considered that what was interesting, what could be definably called modern, was happening in many, many places on many different schedules and for many different reasons, but somehow connected. I was 10 days ago in Bombay, for example, at a conference on modern art, contemporary art. How do you deal with it? How do you write about it? How do you exhibit it? I've been in conferences in Sao Paulo, I've been in conferences in Japan, I've been in conferences all over the place, and in this country. And what becomes most interesting are the relative distinctions rather than the gross distinctions, because I don't think the gross distinctions count for as much as people think they do.
And it seems like they're more similar than you'd expect, is what you're saying.
People are speaking always about something that they have in common, and then some things that they don't have in common, but that they could have in common. And there are impediments to their having in common. There's no doubt that there are cultural differences. There are all kinds of factors that impede the free flow of information. But the nucleus of the problem is very often quite similar. And that is the basis on which you can talk about an international modernism, which is not from the center outward, but is from many centers all the time.
Do you think that part of that has to do with the fact that artists have, no matter what culture they're coming from, have a particular view of life and of the world?
I'm not, I don't think artists per se. I mean, there are many artists who make work which is not related to modernism, which is more traditional in nature, and there are many, many forms of traditionalism. I don't think you can talk about artists in that way, but I think you can talk about people who, that is to say, artists within the larger community, who are actively engaged in figuring out what is possible and what is not only possible, but adds a dimension to what exists.
Right, and actually, I think what I meant to say had to do more with the idea that real artists' work comes out of their experience in life, and regardless of their way of interpreting it. Yeah. How did a nice guy like you come to have such a powerful position?
Because a nice guy hired me, actually. It's as simple as that. I mean, I have no training as a curator. I did the sort of normal career thing that people do, which is to say I went to an art school. I had no reasonable way to earn a living, so I came to New York and did the sheetrocking, art handling, the whole deal. And along the way, another additional thing that you can do if you're in that mode is to write art criticism. So I wrote art criticism, and it's based on that I was hired.
You went to school in Chicago?
Yeah, the Art Institute.
Yeah, and what did you major in painting or art history?
Painting. I never took any art history except as the course you had to take.
Like all of us.
Like all of you. But I'll tell you, my education consists of, one, I had a reasonably good college education, in fact, a very good one. And the other thing is that I worked in bookstores. And bookstores, the trade-off is you're paid horribly, but you get to read the stock. And if you read the stock carefully, you can learn a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm curious, and I'm sure a lot of people in our audience are, about the extent of your curatorial power at the MoMA. It says you are a curator of painting and sculpture. What does that mean? Are there lots of them? Is there a committee?
In my department, there are 4 full-ranking curators. There's the head of the department, Kirk Vernita, who hired me, who's the chief curator of the department. Carolyn Lanchner, whose Léger show is about to open next week, who has done Léger, Paul Klee, Miro, and was a guiding hand in Douanier Rousseau and a host of others. Kenneth McShine, who's been there for a very long time and who has done the Joseph Cornell show with Anne Arnacourt, who did the Warhol show, who did Information, and who is about to do a very interesting show on museums and art, and me. So I'm the junior varsity squad, basically.
And what shows do you have coming up?
And I have Chuck Close, the Danheiser show that just closed, and I have a show of Tony Smith that'll open in July.
And when you say your show and her show and their show, does that mean that you propose the idea and the rest of it? I mean, you...
The way the modern works is essentially that exhibitions are a result of curatorial enthusiasm. You can't just march in and say, I want to do this tomorrow, but you can say, this is the show that I want to do. And in consultation with other curators in other departments as well as within one's own, a program develops. But the basic feeling is that if someone who's there, who's been hired after all because they know something and have passions, has a strong conviction that this is the right artist and the right time and the right way to do it, then the attempt is made to work out how to do it.
And what makes you choose an artist? I mean, what makes you decide on a show to propose?
Many different things. Sometimes it has to do with artists who I think have gotten to a point in their work where things have been clarified, and to show them, to present them, allows you to see them with a clarity that a little while before, or maybe even a little while after, wouldn't exist. Sometimes it's because I think there is a piece of the larger puzzle of the discussions in the art world which is missing, and this particular artist is that piece. Sometimes because there are ideas, and therefore you're talking about several artists, not one artist. I mean, there are a variety of different reasons, and you obviously look at what's being done by other institutions. You look at what other curators are doing. You have to have a sense of moment, and the sense of moment regards both the artist and the situation around them. And it's not a science. It's a matter of, again, a certain degree of passion and strategically
Intuition.
a matter of hunch.
Yeah.
Hunch, I prefer. It's more American. It's kind of corny.
The project rooms, are those yours?
They're not mine, but I'm the chairman of the committee to which they belong. The projects program, which is now 25 plus years old, has run in different ways at different times. But I've been in charge of it since 1990. I actually started in 1991. And my feeling is that it is a chance, one, to show artists who should be seen more. And I'll qualify that by saying it doesn't mean just up-and-coming artists. It means artists who should be seen more, who are sometimes mid-career artists. I just did a show with Franz West, for example, who's an Austrian artist who's 50-plus years old, and who is very visible in Europe and not very visible here, and has not had, since a show at PS1 10 years ago, a real visibility. So sometimes we move in that direction, sometimes they're kids, sometimes they're in between. Anyway, my feeling is that it's not just about showing them, but it's also about cultivating curatorial talent. And there are a lot of people who work at the Modern on staff who contribute, I think, more than anyone can possibly appreciate to the success of the big exhibitions. People who contribute not in just terms of grunt labor, but in terms of real thought and often very much their relationships with the artists that they're involved in. And they're the other side of the talent. Mm-hmm. And so projects is a chance for them to make exhibitions and for them to sort of do something in their own name and with their own ideas. So what I do is I chair. I try not to dictate. In fact, I don't dictate. But I try not to discourage, put it that way. I try to encourage in a way that gives the people who are making the shows a chance to really use their talents, not just to be a showcase for the artist's talents.
Do people propose ideas to you? Do they send you slides?
We get an avalanche of slides. Most of them come to me for starters. Some of them come in to the staff members, but generally they come to me or to something called the projects program. Realistically, very few of them turn into shows. On the other hand, often they alert us to people we didn't know about. And one of the other things I've done, probably more than my predecessors, is to encourage shows that are thematic shows within the projects, rather than doing an individual show or a two-person show, which has existed for a long time. I have encouraged people to think about shows that will put numbers of artists together. And in fairness to Kinniston, I mean, when Kinniston was running it in the early 70s, he did these shows as well, but then they sort of phased out and now they're sort of coming back. And that's a case where sometimes you see something that was not somebody you wanted necessarily to give a whole show to, but who had a very strong work that rhymed with somebody else's strong work, in which case
so you began
they
to
entered
group
the frame.
them, yeah.
So those of you, I presume there are several of you who, if you
We'll
haven't done it
ask.
now, will do it shortly. When you get our form letter, first of all, have pity. We have hundreds of applications. There is no other way that we could do it other than by form letter. But it is true, and I guarantee you that it is true. We look at all of the things that are sent us, and we look at it as a committee. We look at slides, we read dossiers, we look at catalogs, we read proposals, and so on and so forth. Your chances of getting a show that way are very slim. It's like having your first novel published by Random House if you push it over the transom. The other side of the coin, though, is that when we see these things, they keep us up to date with things that are happening out in the world. And when we see particular things that strike us, we remember them. And sometimes we come back to them. Is that a real
That
answer?
was great.
So,
He's answering.
I'm saying, I will break your heart, but I won't break it definitively, okay?
He'll break it nicely.
I won't even break it nicely, but I won't break it definitively.
This is going to take you back a little bit, but
Okay.
and it's partially because, in the December '90 issue of Art in America magazine, you reviewed
Yeah.
a book called Painter of Darkness, Leon Golub
Right.
and Our Times by Gerald Maserati. And in your review, you said that Golub's art of witness and his place in the arena where his place was in the arena where aesthetics and politics meet. Now, on the editorial board of the CAA, you also you co-edited two books on censorship, two
Right.
issues on
Yeah.
censorship,
Yeah.
and the arts. And many of the exhibits that you curate have, I think, political overtones. Is that true? Yeah.
Not all, but many.
Yeah. How's the museum feel about that? Is that
Well, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I mean, I told them that's what I was going to do when they hired me, so they were forewarned, and they obviously were not bothered. I think that the museum has been underestimated in the sphere of politics. The museum has always had political art as a part of its program. It, of course, responds to particular moments of political ferment. In the 1930s, in the 1960s, those were times when the society as a whole was percolating with political ideas, and it made not only sense because of that, but also the art resonated in the way that it would perhaps have not resonated were that not the case in the society at large. And the museum did not blink. There's a famous story of a show that was done sometime in the mid-30s, I guess it was, and I think the artist was Hugo Gellert, I'm not sure, but a guy who was, essentially part of the John Reed clubs, or I forget what exactly, but, on the sort of recognizable left. And he made a painting that had, I think, John D. Rockefeller, Al Capone, and somebody else sort of huddled together, and Capone had a machine gun. And the text of the image was something like, it's us, we're in it together, or it's you or us together, whatever. And Barr had chosen this artist for the show, and somebody went to Mrs. Rockefeller and said, you know what's going to be in this show? And she said,
You know?
yeah, I do. Or maybe she didn't, but in any case, she said she wouldn't censor it. The Modern does not censor exhibitions. And it shows work that is controversial. There are periods when it did not, but not because the work was controversial, but because the mood of the time was not invested in that. And controversy, by the way, is not just political. We have shown and we have bought some of the roughest work that Cindy Sherman's done. We have shown other kinds of things, like Paul McCarthy did a performance piece on video downstairs in the project's room where he dressed up as a drooling, senile de Kooning and proceeded to do a certain number of quite sexual things to paintings, and then had somebody sniff his behind and identify themselves as a collector. There was some nervousness in some quarters, not, by the way, at the top of the museum, but in between. And the fact of the matter is that the director was perfectly happy to do it. Glenn said, by all means, let's do it. So I think that side of the coin is not so problematic.
What are your feelings about the merging of art and politics?
I don't think they merge. I think sometimes they're the same thing. Not always. I mean, I'm
That art is political.
yeah, absolutely. And I, my passions lie in two directions. I have shown Robert Ryman, who's an artist for whom there are no explicit politics, and I think relatively few contextual politics. And I've also shown artists like Adrian Piper, for whom politics are front and center.
Right.
I think sophisticated people can think in both ways, and I think actually the people who are most engaged in politics take the deepest solace and understand most completely the art that is not political. And therefore, you know, I don't see them as antagonistic positions at all. And certainly if you look at the history of modernism, it doesn't make any sense. If half of the Russian constructivists were out there making essentially work about Lenin, and the other half were making work about transcendence to outer space or intraspace or whatever it was, that gives you some indication of just in one period the range. And that range, I should say, is on the walls at the moment. And it makes perfect sense that somebody like me be interested in Leon Golub and Robert Ryman. Whether Bob Ryman and Leon understand each other is not the issue.
Right, right. How does the kind of painting you do affect your taste in curating?
Well, about
What kind of painting do you do?
Say about exactly as we've just described. I just went to Elizabeth Catlett's opening across the street, and some 30 years ago, thanks in part to her intercession, I worked for the Mexican mural painter Siqueiros, and believed fervently, but briefly, that I could make big, significant political paintings. The other side of it is that naturally, if you will call it that, or innately, or however you want to describe it, I prefer to make very minimal paintings, closer to Bob Ryman's. So I'm a split personality. And I think that if you think about people like Ed Reinhardt, for example, they're quite similar. People with very clear, and by the way, also Lucy Depard, who as a critic was divided in this manner, and somebody that I read a lot and continue to read. It's possible to have very strong political convictions and believe that it is important to act in the world on behalf of them, and also think that maybe that's not what belongs in your art. You can recognize it in other people's art and say, huh. And I think there are certain artists, Leon's one, Adrian's another, Yuri Kabakov is another, people for whom the imagination is political. It's not that they are applying their imagination to political problems, that the variables themselves are political in nature. There are other people for whom this is not the case. And the trouble starts when you try to be something you're not.
Of all the I haven't had this.
Hallelujah. Okay, no. We're not getting paid, so this is a relatively small privilege for what's happening up here.
Actually, I'm a little afraid to have any yet, because he's in control, really.
No, it'll be just like an old cedar bar conversation.
Yeah, right on. Of all the exhibits that you've curated, is there one that you're most proud of? Or is that a wrong word to use? That you feel was the most successful? Take it however you'd like.
Well, you can't really expect me to answer that. But actually not. I mean, I think that what a curator does, practically speaking as well in other ways, is to phrase their thoughts, you know, and you make exhibitions of different dimensions and with different emphases, and you make them under their own circumstances after that. And what I'm trying to do is to figure out some stuff, and curating is a way to do that. I'm trying to figure out that stuff with a mind to who the audience is, and again, a mind to what the moment is and what the institution is and so on, but I'm working through problems. And in as much as those problems have concerned anybody else, then I'm doing my job properly. But I'm not so much interested in having successes or failures per se. I'm interested in putting things forth and seeing what other people think, and also what I think and what the artist thinks once they're out there, you know. I've done little tiny shows of which I'm immensely proud, and I've done some big shows that I'm proud of, you know.
Are there any you regret having done?
No, not yet.
I don't know if
Could
that's
happen.
possible.
No, it could definitely happen. I mean, anybody can screw up, you know. And in fact, you're bound to screw up. But so far,
If you're on the edge,
I've made shows
yeah.
that other people didn't like, but I haven't made one that I didn't like yet. This might happen, but you know, I've written articles, and you know, when I wrote I wrote principally for Art in America for years, and that's sort of my home magazine. That's the magazine to which I'm most loyal. And there are articles I wrote there about artists who I thought were going to be terrific, or who, for whatever reasons, seemed terrific for me at the time, and I was deeply engaged. And later on, I read them and I think, you're wrong, you know? Not very wrong, legitimately wrong.
Or you've changed your mind since then.
Or changed my mind, or
Things
just
have
like,
changed, yeah.
you know, I mean, what writing is about, what making exhibitions about, is very similar to what making art is about. You propose something to yourself, and then you work through it. And you should not be ashamed of the things that don't work, and you should certainly not be ashamed of the parts of the things that don't work in big terms that actually do work in small terms. You know, craft or seriousness or what are to be valued. But frankly, there's some things that work all the way through, and others that don't.
Do you feel you've learned?
Well, that's why I'm doing it.
Yeah,
You learn a lot.
yeah.
A lot.
You've often spoken in feminist contexts, like I saw in your bio that you'd spoken at the Feminist Art Institute. I
Yeah.
can't remember if there were other
Oh, I've
situations
done a
as
lot,
well.
yeah.
And I don't know if you're aware of it, but the MoMA, from the Guerrilla Girls standpoint, has the worst record for, and I'm not sure whether it's having
Could
women
be.
artists in their collection or showing women.
I'm not actually sure that it does have the worst record, but I mean...
Their figures say 90% of the artists are male at the MoMA, at the Whitney 82.7%, and at the Guggenheim 79% are male.
Well, okay. Anyway, whatever MoMA's record is, and I'm not going to debate it because it's probably true. I mean, the Guerrilla Girls have done their homework, and I actually have supported them publicly on several occasions. I'm not going to sort of get institutional now. No, I mean, women have been grossly underrepresented in both exhibition programs and collections for generations. I do think there are many problems with how you correct that. I think the problems are not just on the side of the museum, but on the perceptions of the world at large. That articles like the article that Linda O'Loughlin wrote in 1971-72 of Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists are artists that should be, are articles that should be reread every time one ventures into that territory, because what her argument says is that you do not simply remedy it by anointing people ex post facto as important when the conditions were such that people could not achieve their full dimensions. It is, and this, by the way, holds true of all kinds of social and political things.
Exactly.
You cannot rewrite art history as it happened. You can pay closer attention to it than people have done, and I think that is absolutely a part of the puzzle. And I think that museums as a whole should be collecting in depth and carefully people whose reputations are not the equal of Picasso and Matisse, but who made very solid, real work. And often it's those people who influence younger artists 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And the ability to have a work by, let me think of somebody, Leigh Bondicoux, for example. I mean, and she is major by comparison to some other people, but
Right.
she's also an artist who had a moment that passed out of favor. To show Leigh Bondicoux in relationship to not just Eva Hess, but Elizabeth Murray and people to come, is an argument for doing that kind of work in the collections and building ex post facto backwards the really strong ones. But it's very complicated, and the complications have to do with all kinds of issues, for example, and I'll spell them out a little bit. It is very hard to go to an artist who has been neglected and say to them, look, I cannot make your life right. I cannot correct all the injustices, but I can get the right piece in, and you and I, as of this moment, have to negotiate that in realistic terms. I cannot correct all the market injustices. I cannot give you the great payday at the end of your lifetime. I cannot do all of those things, but I can act as an agent to bring the piece I want to have there and that you should want to have there into the discussion. But there are often cases of artists who are so angry that they want vindication, and they therefore want to go from a position of unjustified obscurity to the head of the pack, you know. And that is a self-defeating proposition when you're dealing with institutions and with the whole structure of art history. That doesn't happen.
And it sort of sounds like you as a curator almost see yourself as an agent for the artist, too, at times, in that situation.
I stand between two things, and I stand between an institution that writes art history on the walls and the artists I know that are out there who are actually making art history. And the institution can't have all the things it wants all the time on its terms, and the artist can't have all the things that they want on their terms. Curators, if they do their job properly, work in between to get the optimum, not the best, but the optimum result.
In terms of, I guess, the impact an artist can have, do you think it's more important? Well, the most important thing, of course, is the work. We always say that the most important thing is your work.
Yeah.
But after that, I mean, to what battle should artists fight, do you think, to get their work out and seen now, to get it collected, to get it purchased?
That's not really my specialty, is to give career advice to artists.
Is that a career?
I mean, I can give it to them when there's like some specific thing on the table, but I'm not a coach. I've taught in a lot of art schools, and they always ask me to be a coach there, and I've refused, and I'm not going to do it here and now. One thing artists should be realistic. You know, you will only get hurt if you are not realistic. And I get to say this because I'm an artist who is not famous for his art and who does not expect to show in the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, I joke periodically that what I'm really doing is I'm preparing my own retrospective. But realistically, I know that as much as I believe in my own work, and I truly do, and as much as I actually do my own work, which I also truly do, I am not likely to have the kind of success that the Museum of Modern Art represents. I would like to have, in a sense, the audience that I have earned rather than the audience that I fantasize. And I think artists must really think that one through.
Yeah.
Because if they do, then they can identify the people who will be truly their advocates rather than beating their brains out and becoming bitter by vesting their imaginary futures in people who will not be their advocates in situations where even if they wanted to, they could not be their advocates. You know? I make good minimalist paintings. Minimalism is not a going concern right this minute. Hard edge abstraction is not a going concern. I wouldn't curate me.
What's the going concern right now? What's the going concern?
I don't know. I'm supposed to know,
It's
but I
not
don't.
those things, but
Well, I mean, one thing is very plain is that there is an enormous amount of interesting video and video-related work, video and film work. It's sometimes installation work, it's sometimes on-screen work, it's all kinds of stuff. I love painting. I love looking at painting. I love making paintings and so on and so forth. But I must say that that there's a lot that is not painting that's being made that is by itself interesting. And the other thing is that it is a lot of stuff that is not painting that is taking the prerogatives of painting. You know, if one of the things that happened in the 60s was that narrative got chased out of painting because we were not supposed to tell stories and create illusions and blah, 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 well, some good painting got made on that premise. Many of the painters that I advocate believe that firmly. Ryman is one. But that meant there was a job description just sort of hanging there, you know? So video artists, performance artists, installation artists have taken those options. And they are doing really extraordinary things. And I think as a curator now, not as a practitioner, I am often drawn to stuff which is not in the medium that I take the most immediate pleasure from. But I recognize that the work itself is extremely accomplished, extremely serious, and has created a medium out of what was in fact once just a technology.
and it's provoking, yeah.
No, it's rich. It's got sensual properties. They don't happen to be the ones that I learned when I was growing up, but they happen to be ones that somebody else learned and now know how to use extremely well.
Mm-hmm. In the New York Times Weekend section, January 30th, Michael Kemmelman talks about Courbet as the avant-garde artist needing a rear guard. And he calls the idea of the avant-garde an anachronism in today's art world. Interestingly, in an article you wrote for Art in America on Eric Fischel, entitled Desperate Pleasures, November 1984, for anyone who wants to look it up. You talk about frontal assaults of the old avant-garde having little impact with our daily diet of media-manipulated alarms and diversions, and rebellion as commodity. Yet it seems the critics do still fall over themselves to endorse the new. And what's your take on the new or the avant-garde, the cutting edge?
Okay. There's a lot written now about how the avant-garde was a creation of a particular period where there was an identifiable and organized and institutionally structured bourgeois taste. And then the avant-garde was there both fighting it and leading elsewhere. And that's a description of the late 19th century in France, for example, or perhaps certain periods of American art, 30s and 40s into the 50s. But those are historically specific descriptions because it's very hard to really identify during most of history, as opposed to those particular moments where history sort of comes to a head, what's ahead and what's behind.
Right.
And the avant-garde in French means the before guard, the guard ahead of the troops, as if the troops were already marching and there was somebody out there in front being point. My view of the reality of art making is that it very seldom is that channeled and very focused. More it's like an amoeba, right? It's a mass of stuff that's being made within a particular historical moment, and there is an edge to it, but the edge is not necessarily leading anywhere, it's just spreading like a blob, you know? And inside that blob, there is acquired territory. And there are people who are inside that blob who are making terrific realist paintings, terrific color field paintings, terrific minimalist paintings, but they are all within a tradition which is already colonized in a sense. And they cannot they cannot be said to be leading anything, but they can be extremely accomplished and important, by the way, not just accomplished. They're not just like playing catch up. They can make great art in that context, but they're within a tradition. The people on the edge are what we normally call the avant-garde, but they're not taking this amoeba anywhere. They're just the edge of the amoeba, you know? And that's the same thing. There are people who are making realist paintings on the edge of the amoeba, and there are people who are making videos on the edge of the amoeba, and there are people who are making minimalist art on the edge of the amoeba, who are doing something that's really fresh, that has to do with not acquired territory, but acquiring territory. And that's the way I look at it. And when I'm sort of excited by an artist, it is either somebody who's in the middle of the pack doing something that you could never imagine being done because everybody thought it was all done, or was somebody on the edge of the pack who's doing something that you thought, Jesus Christ, I've never seen that before. And that's it, you know? And there's a lot of stuff in between.
I'm imagining this amoeba.
Well,
It's
okay,
great. I love it.
I'll give you an example. I mean, like, you know, within realist painting, I used to be a realist painter. That was my in-between step, right? Between socialist realism and abstraction, I was a realist. Okay, if you look at somebody like Philip Pearlstein in the, early 60s, he made incredibly clear, hard-edged, tough, unexpected paintings in a tradition where everybody thought it was all done. Posing him nude in the studio. First of all, you shouldn't do it, and then, of course, you wouldn't do it.
So he was an avant-garde nude painter, wasn't he?
Okay. Then you look at who? Rackstraw Downs, going out and painting landscapes. I mean, who would do that? Especially coming out of Yale, where you're much too smart to do that. These are artists who identified a possibility that was totally intellectually understandable, but the results were unexpected. That's one category. Another category is who? Somebody like David Hammons, somebody like Tom Friedman, people who are doing stuff.
Matthew Barney,
people who are doing stuff I've never seen before.
Robert Gober.
I've seen that before.
Have you?
I like it, but I think he's in the pack.
at the end of one of your articles, actually the one on Rackstraw Downs.
You worked hard. Jesus.
Thank you.
I'm getting scared now because the next quote's going to be the
Yeah, but I'm
quote.
on my last page. I'm getting scared too.
Okay, sorry.
That was Art in America, guys, 1984, October.
Yeah.
You wrote, I want to thank my father, Richard Storr, for an early and scholarly introduction to landscape painting and for long walks looking for the things seen in pictures. And I love that idea. You know, we usually think of the opposite, or the reverse. Can you comment on that in relationship to the things you might see in pictures or art made today?
Well, you really did work hard, and you really have unnerved me.
I didn't mean it here.
Okay, you better keep this now. My father and I have as complicated a relationship as any father and son could possibly have. But he is an interesting man. He was a Depression baby with no advantages in the arts, who learned how to look all by himself. And we did, in fact, several walking tours in England. Well, one in particular, where he was going there and I was, student abroad kind of thing. And he decided that what he wanted to do was to show me sites that existed in pictures painted by Cotman, Sandby, Girton, and people like that. And the famous Brunel photograph of, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a famous photograph of Brunel, who was an engineer, a British engineer in the Victorian period. And he's standing there next to chains, and he's got a top hat and so on and so forth. And he said, well, this guy actually didn't just pose for the photograph, he built bridges and stuff like that, and he built boats. Let's go look at it. So we did those tours.
How old were you?
And I was 21 and difficult. And he was, 60 and difficult. That's the anecdotal part of it. The real part of it is that I think looking is thinking. And my father's an intellectual, not a looker primarily, but looking taught him to think about things he would not have been prepared to think about otherwise. I'm the other side of the coin. I'm a looker, and looking has forced me to think about thinking in ways that I would not have done. And we sort of met in the middle. And I think that a lot of the debates in the art world are about, are you an intellectual or are you a sensualist? Are you an aesthete or a conceptual person? And I think the point is that the traffic should be back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And wherever you start, you should be dragged, kicking and screaming in the opposite direction. So a kind of corny painting of villages and pub and vicarage kind of stuff that I would not have taken seriously, he taught me to take seriously.
And part of it, too, that I was thinking about was how since then, well, actually not since then, because that wasn't so long ago, but our world is quite an ugly place now. And the things that artists are forced to look at.
The world's never been a nice place.
Really?
It's never been a nice place. I'm working with Paolo Herkenhoff on the Sao Paulo Biennale. And I'm doing, he's the supreme commander, if you will, and I'm doing a subsection of it. And the whole theme of the exhibition is cannibalism. And it's a very interesting and very clever idea, which I will say a little bit about. That in American terms, when we talk about multiculturalism, we are mostly thinking about the imposition of the colonists upon the people they colonized.
Right.
There is a Brazilian art critic of the 20s, named Andrade, I believe, who saw this differently. And it's a wonderful series of sort of reversals of stereotypes. The Brazilians were identified in the 16th century as being the cannibalistic people. Columbus so-called discovered America, and as he discovered America, he identified that there were these people who ate other people. And then there's this quite marvelous book that's been written about this, about who ate who and where they were doing the eating, and it ended up that it was mostly Brazil, right? So
As far as we know.
yeah. So anyway, so Brazil was caricatured as this country of man-eaters. And then there was a very subtle kind of debate between Montaigne, who was a humanist philosopher, and other people about, well, why were they eating these people? Was it just because they liked to eat people? Or because they had sort of reasons we could identify with, like revenge and a few other things? So anyway, so cannibalism. Anyway, this critic in the 20s had this idea that the relationship of the colonized to the colonizer was that they ate them. And that rather than having culture imposed upon you, you consumed the imposer. And you consumed everything in sight. And that there was a way in which
It wasn't spiritual.
Oh, it was definitely spiritual, but it was also, nutritious. So what it was really about was about reversing the roles, basically. And the person who is not just the passive recipient or the not passive but downtrodden endurer of the outside, but somebody who exercises their own metabolism on what's coming at them, and that so-called colonialized people end up using the invader
Right.
by eating the invader, which I think is a wonderful metaphor because, whether or not people who look like me were the colonists at one point or another, a lot of American culture is about outside stuff coming in different generations and different epochs. And America is a wonderful case of a cannibalistic culture. We eat each other, but we eat foreigners too.
So how does this relate to having an exhibit?
How's that? It is an attempt in the context of Brazil to make an exhibition that deals with international modernism, not as something that is to be brought in as a treasure and admired, completely made, but rather it is to be brought in as something that will eventually be consumed and dispersed and absorbed. And it's a terrific idea.
Oh, really? When's it going to happen?
About 6 months from now.
So it's decided.
Well, the idea is decided. The show has to be rounded up still.
Can artists submit slides?
You've been very kind so far. So
don't push it, huh?
don't push it.
Oh, wow. And
But I'll tell you why I said that, actually. This is another thing. That one of the great parts about what I do is I get to travel a lot. And for years, I was an underpaid art critic and schlepper in the art world in New York, and I didn't travel. And the particular period in which I got my airline tickets was a period where the art world became truly international. And the most interesting exhibitions are now being done all over the world. And New York has got to realize that it is not about us.
yeah.
And it's not about whether people are in the pecking order here. And it's, for that matter, since I originally come from Chicago, not about second city versus first city stuff. America is merely one country in the art world, And a lot of the most interesting thinking about American art, not to mention the art coming from other places, is being done other places. So my, alliance, if you want to call that, with Paolo, is not based on my being hired as the American curator at the Museum of Modern Art, blah, 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 blah. Paolo is my natural interlocutor, and he is teaching me something I don't know. And I think the American art world will benefit enormously from realizing that just getting it, fighting the internecine stuff here will get you nowhere. You've got to be ready to think about what's being done in Seoul, what's being done in Johannesburg, what's being done in Istanbul, and so on. And if you think the competition is between, Houston Street and 53rd, or between Chicago and LA and New York, you're fucked.
Yeah. That's the global art community you were talking
Yeah.
about.
Tough, isn't it?
Yeah,
We may all be obsolete, all of us.
What's your favorite swear word?
That's the one. My daughter, I used to, when my computer misbehaved, I would say it quite often. and quite for long periods of time. And she came to me one day, and she was at that time 7 or 8, and she said, Daddy, could you just please say phooey? And I said, it's just not the same.
Right, it doesn't work. And here, my last paragraph was, about how New York is the big pond.
It is not the big pond. New York is a very small pond. And I was talking to a guy who works for the Conservation Department of the Modern, and I were downtown photographing Tony Smith this morning. And he'd spent 3 years in London, and he was saying how glad he was to be back. And mind you, this was when the BritPac were breaking out and so on and so forth. So I do understand that there's a level of ferment here that is unlike any other place that I know of. It's, London is not the same density. Cologne is not the same density. Berlin is not the same density. Paris is hopeless. But just because we have a higher density doesn't mean we're really the action anymore. And the sooner we outgrow the notion that anything that matters will come to us, the sooner we'll be part of the real art world as it really is now. You have to go from here to there. If the Londoners have to go from one part of London to the other part of London, and the Germans have to commute from Cologne to Berlin, and so on and so forth, we have to get out of town. And also think that when we're getting out of town, we're not just bestowing our intelligence on people who need it, we are actually connecting with the people who have other ideas that really matter.
Sometimes we have to not say we're from New York, too, I think.
Well, that you can't hide. I can't hide it.
You ready for audience questions?
Sure.
Audience questions? Good. You want to take mine?
No, it's all right. If you're in the first 3 rows, say, then I can pass you the mic. But if you're further back, like you, please come up, and I'll give you the mic. Come up to the front of the pillar here. Thank you.
Just on the subject of cannibalism, I have a very good friend who went to New Guinea and studied the Asmat, and he traced down the Michael Rockefeller disappearance story, and he brought back a lot of photographs about it. But the point, I'm not asking a question, I would like to just add some information. And what they found was that basically cannibals were in eating the victim, gaining the power of the victim, gaining the strength, gaining the intelligence, and the far-seeing ability of that individual, or the foresight or whatever it was that he had that made him a great warrior. So some of that may be true of the Brazilian people too.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of cannibalism, if you look at it from the point of influence, for example, what a really canny artist does in allowing themselves to be influenced is to consume somebody else. And there, I guess, a couple of prerequisites.
Picasso did it.
Yeah, Picasso did it, and many people have done it. I mean, de Kooning consumed Picasso. I mean, it's like, the famous drawing of the fish. Right? The point is, be sure that you totally consume the person that you are eyeing, because you don't want anything left over that can be identified with them. And the other thing is, make sure that you do not eat stupid people.
I just wanted to ask you on the curatorial level, we know Seoul is coming on, in the far,
I'm sorry,
Seoul, Korea is coming on, and Sao Paulo is coming.
I have a friend, Apinan Prashananda, who's a curator in Thailand, and I know other people coming from other places. I think you have to assume that the economic crisis in the Far East now is going to have a profound effect on their freedom to do the work that they were going to do. I think that it probably will have a twofold effect. One is The subsidies are simply have been removed. I was writing a catalog for a show in Seoul that was canceled from one day to the next as a result of the markets. Two, much like in this country, when people are flush and euphoric, they jump into the arts. When that hits, when the crisis hits, they don't just come back to the arts the next time they have the same amount of money. In the 1990s, the fortunes made are probably far in excess of what was made in the 80s, but people have not returned as patrons the way they did in the 80s. There is a disillusionment, there is a caution, there are all kinds of things that happen. And I would expect that the situation in Asia will be very different starting now than it has been for the last 10 years and more. And the first part of it will be simple austerity. The second part of it will be they will think about doing it differently. And they will think about it very carefully because it will have to be thought about very carefully. How do you put the pieces together? Do you spend lavish amounts of money to make international shows that compete directly with the biennales that exist? Or do you do more selective, more carefully curated shows? Do you think about bringing East and West together, or do you think about bringing East and East together? I mean, there are lots and lots of very serious problems that were there, but that will rise to the surface as a result of this sort of stop in the action. But the other thing that we who are in this country have to think about is that there is a lot of art being made in the Far East that is modern or contemporary art, that there is a genuine audience for that art, that there are patrons for that art, that there are critics for that art, that they are aware of us, but they are not necessarily wildly enthusiastic about us. There was a show of Cindy Sherman's work that was sent by the Modern to a museum in New Delhi. And I'll say this for starters because I'm going to say something else which seems deprecating. I'm a huge fan of Cindy Sherman. I think she's one of the real survivors of the 80s and one of the great artists of the moment, and for several moments. This exhibition was shown in Delhi, and when I was there, I picked up the newspaper, the Times of India, and there was this, sort of, centerfold thing in full color, very elaborate thing, which is their culture section, and I read the following. Something to the effect of saying, we in Asia were not able to enjoy the prosperity that the West had going up. So why should we be so interested in the West when it's going down? And then the second thing, which was the punchline, the joke, was, are we interested in Kentucky Fried Chicken when we can have tandoori chicken? Now, this was a very sophisticated writer because the jokes were not just mean jokes. They were knowing jokes. And I do think you have to, again, think that in Asia, what's going on is an enormous and broad-based and very uneven change. The prosperity in one country is not matched by another, but the ferment intellectually may be greater in the country where there's less prosperity, and back and forth. You're seeing the world completely be remapped. And we have not just to think again about getting into shows or where the action is or who's got the most money. That was phase one, and it's actually the minor phase. The real phase is where do all the cultural components come together, where do they not? When they don't, what is produced nonetheless, and so on. And this applies to Africa, this applies to Latin America, this applies all over the world. That's all right, pass it. Somebody pass it back.
With all the emphasis being placed on video and photography, could you give your opinion on the relevance and importance of painting today?
Well, you knew it was a tough road to hoe when you started, right? I hope. No, I mean, painting has a future, and I'm teaching a course now at the Institute of Fine Arts about this issue. And the theme of the course is, well, why isn't painting dead when it was supposed to be? I don't think painting will ever die. I think it's undeniable that painting's central position has changed. I think it remains central, but it is not the only thing that's central. It's like an opera, where the baritone, the bass, the soprano, and everybody else comes on stage and they all take bows together. painting is no longer Luciano Pavarotti, but it's not exactly just the sacristan in Tosca, right? I mean, it's like there is a role for painting, but it cannot assume anything. It must prove itself painting by painting, artist by artist, moment by moment. And on the other hand, I think as a painter, one of the mistakes that painting made, and it's an interesting mistake, and it produced interesting painting, but it is a mistake, I think. One of the mistakes that painting made in the 1980s was to try to compete directly with media. That certain kinds of montage, collage, mixing of sources looks pretty good in David Salle, part of it, looks very good in Polka, who's by far the superior artist. But I do think in some basic ways that painting is not the best vehicle for doing that, because I think media does it a lot better. And I think there are things that painting can do which are slow and which are not fixed in the sense of stuck and static, but have to do with fixation, with a degree of stability, but only a degree, that the media cannot do. And I hesitate to say this because it sounds an awful lot like Greenberg, and I never liked the man. But I do think there are certain things that are relatively speaking within painting's range as opposed to other things that are relatively within other ranges of other media. And if I was a painter, I would at least start with those. I know, but I'm saying,
Just a number of questions. The NEA and the idea of a collective, or of the lack of authorship, or of the end to a star system. I mean, it's just an idea, because you seem to be describing concepts that are fairly established of individuals who become the emergent. What about the collective, the media? The media is often produced by a collective.
Yeah.
Just thoughts. And the NEA, support for the arts.
That's a whole different thing. First, collectives versus individuals. You will never, in this country or any other country, get rid of the star system. That is naive. It is sincere, I'm sure, but it is naive. And what happens to collectives is that they become stars. And often what happens to collectives, if they're not well organized, is that they begin to fight amongst themselves once they become stars to see who's going to be the most star one of the collective. And the Tim Rollins experience is about that. I am all for collectives. I think collectives can do work that other arrangements cannot do. And I think that group material, wait till I'm finished. The group material did marvelous things, and that Fluxus did marvelous things, and that Gutai did marvelous things. What?
And situationism. It's just
and situation.
philosophy.
But I am not a philosopher, and I'm not a believer that you can make the world better than it is. I think you can buy time in a world which is as bad as it is to do specific things. And I think that there are moments where collectives thrive, and there are moments where they are hopeless propositions. I also think there are certain people who are able to operate in collectives. My wife is a musician, and she talks a lot about the difference between the music that she makes, which is ensemble music, and the music that is made by other people that went to school with her, which is basically they are soloists playing with orchestras or singing in front of orchestras or what have you. There are temperaments that are involved in this. And you have to be very clear about what is within your range and what is within the range of the culture at a particular moment. But collectives will not solve the star system.
So the rest of the emerging world in art that you're describing is, you think, also going to be bound by this whole sort of star system mentality?
Not bound by it, it is a factor. The reason that certain people that are identified from this emerging world are identified as they are is not just a function of our star system, it is a function of the need that people have to focus energy on somebody, and the need that those people who make the work have to have that energy in order to do their work.
The feeding.
It takes two to tango.
The cannibalism.
Which is not to say I don't value the collectives. It's just to say they are always in some kind of dialectical tension with the prima donnas. And you can always have both.
My name is David Margolis.
Yeah, sorry, can't hear.
David
I've been in the Modern Museum in the 30s, so I'm an old-timer. Now, I was searched. I had exhibition on 57th Street 13 years ago of my sculpture, and the art director from which the museum, Mr. Wooden, saw the work. And he celebrated 50 years of the museum in which of my sculpture, 27 pieces, welded aluminum. Also, recently, I had a show 3 years ago in Moscow of my recent work, which the museum bought, Czech Museum bought 2 paintings, and also the Hermitage. Now, an art director discovered me. What kind of work do you do to discover the artists of New York City? Do you walk around in the galleries and you see new talent? I speak history, my dear friend. I'm 86 years old. I came here because Wernick is a friend of mine, and when I hear what you got to say. Here, I read here a young man, Bill, very talented young man. Go and see his work. Many young people here, great talent. Thank you very much.
Okay. Number one, I'm acutely aware of what I think you are describing as a problem. It is a problem. You must be acutely aware in turn of what the conditions are on the other side of the coin. If, in light of what I've already said about the international nature of art, about not just the international nature of it, but the many different kinds of art being made. I think my microphone went dead, but anyway. The many kinds of art being made. The reality is that there are 4 people in my department who must pay attention to the 4 or 5 active generations, maybe 6 active generations of artists operating in 20 or 30 identifiable modes and a few media in all the cities of the world. Now, that's an exaggeration, but not by much. I don't often go to see exhibitions in Russia or wherever it is, but I should. And the artists in Russia are as upset about what is not seen as you may be upset about what is not seen. The reality is that if the modern as an institution is to deal with the full flux of art, it will fail because there is more of it than it can ever take into account. The more realistic question is whether the overall mix represents something like the overall mix of what is out there, not whether the specific errors of omission or commission are as important as they may seem to the people involved. I think that my museum missed a great deal in the 60s and 70s. I think that the museum as it's presently constituted is much more open to the kinds of things that it missed in that period. It's much more broad in its taste, much more international in its taste, and so on. But even if we're operating at the top of our capacity, and with all the goodwill in the world, it is a fraction of what is legitimately our concern. And just because you live in New York, you don't have a greater claim than somebody who lives in Sao Paulo or Tokyo.
You speak about seeing and understanding a wide range of art, minimalism to figurative, whatever else. But whatever, I find that the corporate mentality, especially in the United States, has drained out from art the humanistic element, even though it may be figurative.
I didn't get that. I heard corporate and figurative, but I'm not sure what the connection is.
What I'm saying is that the culture we live in now has drained out of all art, more or less, the humanistic element. That even people who paint figurative work nowadays do figures that are robotic in some extent, that are cold, that will not give forth an expression of the human element. They consciously avoid it.
I'll give you a sort of a split response. One, I think the corporate reality is a part of humanity. It may be an unpleasant and negative one, but that people who deal with a more mechanized, a more orderly, in the not so good sense, definition of modernity are serious artists, trying to find the pulse within images which at the same time represent a society which is constrained, that is hierarchical and so on, is one of the themes of modern art. If George Grosz or Oskar Schlemmer or any number of people in the 30s were aware of this, there's every reason to be aware of it now. So making unwarm pictures of human beings doesn't mean you're an unwarm human being. It may be simply that you recognize a fact of life. The other side of it is that we're dealing in a world where you must assume that the so-called corporate reality will not go away. So you must find your allies within it rather than pretend that there's a day when you can live without it. You know, I mean, I'll tell you, I don't think that painting which bleeds is automatically better painting than painting that doesn't bleed.
Okay, next.
And I'm saying this as somebody who bleeds, you know. Yeah.
I had a question about art criticism.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask who you were reading when you began writing, who were models for your early writing, and also who you're reading now, who you read with special eagerness or avidity in terms of very contemporary work.
As I said, I worked in bookstores, and I read promiscuously and enthusiastically. I was a better make-it man in my reading habits than I was in my sex life. And I read all across the board. I read out of contemporary art, out of modern art. I read art history. I read things, memoirs. I mean, reading Cellini, you know, was as important as reading Harold Rosenberg. I don't have a particular model, but I would say this. I value people who are good writers. I am not so interested in people who just have good ideas. I think that often people who have good ideas have less good ideas than they perceive if they can't write well. I don't think it's. I had a sort of a sort of classical education. I think that if you cannot say it well, it's probably not as good as you think it is. Occasionally it is. Occasionally there are obscure geniuses, but there are an awful lot of obscure adults who think they're geniuses, and I am very leery of them. In terms of other people who specifically influenced me, in a negative but an engaged way, I was influenced by Greenberg. I think his errors and his flaws and his gifts, which are considerable, are a cautionary lesson. I was deeply influenced by Lucy Lepard. I was probably more than anybody else influenced by Baudelaire. And then I read all across the board. And nowadays, if you ask the question about what I read Peter Sheldon, I read David Hickey, I read a lot of younger art writers whose bylines I don't know, but I sort of recognize them when I see them, and I read them, and I'm not deceived. Mostly I read poetry, and I read history. And one of the interesting things about the writing that's done now is that we're beginning to see, it's only beginning, we're beginning to see people who read history. For most of the 80s, we saw people who read philosophy, but for whom there were very few facts. And facts, of course, are not facts, I know that. But very few identifiable, concrete, arguable things, you know? You read people who talked in generalizations. And I am interested in people who can think in generalizations but talk in specifics. And therefore, reading poets who do that, or reading historians who do that, is much more supportive of what I try to do myself than the other. And then I read detective stories.
Do you like William Gibson?
I do, actually.
You compared the contemporary art world to an amoeba sort of moving around and incorporating.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned the significance of video art and, I guess, technology.
Yeah.
And, of course, there are certain artists who you think are significant in our time. But do you think the contemporary art world has a structure to it, or is it just an amorphic, ill-defined something that's just moving in no direction at all?
Okay, I like that. That's good. Because that's image to image as opposed to big idea to big idea. No, the art world does have a structure to it. And therefore, you're talking about amoeba with a skeleton, which is a biological nonentity, but in fact, it describes the art world. There is a definite structure. The structure is always in the process of being modified and always prone to rigidifying when it realizes its own changes. In other words, the structure of the art world tends to seize up at the moments when the people who think they've got it under control begin to wonder whether they do. You know, and that's when it functions badly. If you think, to take images, of a loosely bodied and skinned entity, which is not quite amoebic, but close, more like an elephant, with a skeleton which moves inside this great skin, that's when the art world's functioning well. It is something that can take shocks, take surprises, and adapts. The periods when that's been the case, in my own experience, are the 1970s and the 1990s. The 60s was a period of every percussive confrontation created a percussive reaction. And generally, it also meant that the people who were in positions of authority got tough. We're the boss, we know, right? In the 1980s, everybody was competing to be the boss. And the arguments were very interesting, and I enjoyed them, but I was a sideliner at that point, so I was listening. The 1980s are very fluid, actually, still, surprisingly so. And I think that's generally a good thing. That I think the art world now is functioning more or less like it ought to. And not all the people I value are rewarded accordingly. And some of the people I don't like are rewarded, you know, more than they should be, but not extravagantly like the 80s and not dogmatically like the 60s.
When you travel to New Delhi, to Africa, to other parts of the world, what kind of art are you seeing there that we don't see here in New York City?
Well, I've not been to Africa yet, actually. I'm hoping to go, but I've seen art from Africa, and I know of what's going on there to a certain degree.
New Delhi?
What art do I see? First
I'm
of
just
all,
curious. I've never been to these places.
well, I mean, you see a lot of things. You see a lot of junk, you know.
A lot of tourist
You
art.
see a lot of junk here, too, by the way. This is not
Yeah,
a
right.
relative judgment.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's a lot of bad art out there, you know. Some of it's made by people who are smarter than the art they make. You know, so that what you're looking at is a sort of cultural, how would you call it? Things are moving, and anything that's moving is interesting to me. But it may not be intrinsically interesting. It's only its movement that is interesting. And there's stuff that I see in New York where I think the art is terrible, but I'm interested in why somebody would do that, and how they did it, and how if they did it better, it might actually be really pretty good. And do they know that? And do they take advantage of the opportunities that exist and so on? So when I make those kind of judgments about what I see outside, it's not to say nothing can happen there, this is like a hopeless situation. It's just like, right this minute, it's not too good.
Well, does their art generally
But there are also some good stuff, by the
reflects
way.
their culture, I'm sure, doesn't it?
It does reflect the culture, but you have to give the benefit of the doubt. Until somebody has proven an absolute narrow-minded, ethnocentric bigot, you have to assume that they're probably looking for something that is richer than not. So if I say, for example, most of the painting I saw in India was not very interesting, but some of it was interesting, but most was not, but that some of the conceptual stuff was more interesting, and that some of the writing was more interesting than the painting, and some of the films are more interesting than the writing, then you're saying this is a culture that is working on 2 or 3 cylinders, not all 6. Our culture, by the way, is not working on all 6. We're not producing such great movies these days, but we're producing interesting visual art. The writing's okay. You're looking at relative moments and opportunities. And I am perfectly willing to admit that I have biases, but I don't think you should start out by identifying people's inability to see. More, you should start out with the assumption that no culture is always in full deployment. And therefore, there are reasons that you find things happening in the way they do. And the important thing is to make sure that the things that are really good get the attention that they would not get otherwise. And there are institutional reasons that they don't, and those are the ones you have to fight very hard about.
Any more? Any more?
Since you have mentioned such a broad wealth of material, do you feel that the people who have worked within the area of illustration have gotten necessarily a bad rap or should be considered in the art world if they are functioning in it, or because they have that term related to their part of their work or some of their work, they aren't to be looked at askance?
Illustration. Let me say that there's a lot. Alex Katz once said, and that's a term that there's an idea that I appreciate. He said, a jerk is somebody who competes with the wrong guy. Allowance is made for the fact that it's not just guys. The desire to compete with de Kooning if you were making illustrations seems to me a misidentified ambition. If you're an illustrator, you're competing with Fritz Eichenberg or Edward Sorel or Art Spiegelman. And he's more than an illustrator, but he is also an illustrator.
Or Alan Kober, who is more than an illustrator.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just, I'm not going to name all the names because I don't know all the names, but I do look at the pictures. What I'm saying is that and the same thing happens in the craft world. I sit on the board of the Tiffany Foundation, and I am involved in their jury. And there is a lot of discussion about the role of craft in relation to so-called fine arts. The people who are usually in the most trouble on both sides of the line are people who want to make the distinction disappear rather than people who want to capitalize on the things that they do well. And I think an illustrator, a good illustrator, is somebody who is engaged in using visual media to bring to the fore something that is inherent in a text. And I'll give you one in-between case with a guy I've worked with a lot, which is Ilya Kabakov. Ilya Kabakov knew he was not a great painter, okay? And was educated in the Soviet system as an illustrator, and he was one of the superlative illustrators of children's books. And I said I worked in the book business. For 3 or 4 years, I was an importer of Russian books. And I know what Soviet illustration is, and I've looked at what Ilya does, and he was really good. There's a lot of bad Soviet illustration in this period, and this was in the old days. He was a really good illustrator. He never thought he was anything other than an illustrator, except when he in fact created his own medium, which was installation and conceptual work. And Vasilyev and Eric Bolatov were in the same situation. And those guys didn't try to say, we're illustrators, but we're really Repin, or de Kooning or whoever it is. They were illustrators. And then because illustration was not a sufficient vessel for what they wanted to do, they created a new one. So my feeling about this is that anybody who comes from that territory, who creates the new category, hats off, and I'm interested. Anybody who's just mad because artists on the other side are disproportionately rewarded is mad at a sociological fact which they and I are aware of and think is unjust, maybe, but it ain't gonna change. And they don't do their profession any good by pretending that they're something they're not.
This will be the last question.
Okay? They do it a dishonor, actually. It's almost like they're ashamed of being illustrators when that's a pretty damn hard and pretty good thing to be.
Okay.
Hmm?
I don't think Michelangelo was ashamed.
I don't think he was an illustrator.
Going back to your amoebic skeletal reference, I've shown internationally and not much in New York, so I have an affinity for that global culture.
Yeah.
But I want to pinpoint it more to the skeletal reference. Going forward, say towards the millennium, do you as a critic see the art world as a chiropractor, meaning you're going to make the adjustment, or do you see the art world as adjusting the critic, and how?
I mean, you'd say it again because I was laughing at the first thing you said. And it was good.
Well, I make the poignant questions pretty humorous. Going forward, do you as a curator and critic see the art world entire in need of an adjustment? And if so, what? Or do you see the art world in need of giving the curator and critic an adjustment, and if so, what?
No, the art world is always in need of adjustment. I mean, for heaven's sakes. And what artists and curators and critics do is they apply their own adjustments, and the body says ouch, or yes, or ouch and yes. You know, the body is this sort of thing that is all of us. And each one of us has our professional or perceived professional expertise in these matters, and we do the best we can to sort of get it right, and we mostly get it wrong, but we get parts of it right along the way. No, I am a 1960s radical working for an institutional entity. They know that, I know that. I should add, by the way, that there are many people in the museum who are also, aging 60s radicals. So that we are people who have come to terms with the limits of what we can do, but who are also very determined to do what we intend to do. And this is just a moment in history. The 60s was about changing how institutions functioned, and they needed to be changed. If you were invited to actually do it, you cannot be disingenuous about it. You can't then sort of pretend that you're not a part of the institution, either to the institution or the people outside of it. You have to say, I'm no longer a revolutionary, I'm a reformer, right? Judge me not by my failed revolutions, but my maybe failed and maybe successful reforms. That's the level of chiropractic we're talking about. But I also know that I am, for all that I occupy a fairly conspicuous job, I have colleagues who work in other institutions, who work outside institutions, who are the people who call me up on the phones at night and say, Rob, did you really say that? Did you really mean that? I belong to a very large network of people, and I listen to them, and they, I hope, listen to me. The people you should be afraid of are the ones who think that once they've entered the institution, they no longer have to listen. Okay? Because I listen doesn't mean I'm passive, as I hope you have understood. I will argue. I will fight for things that I believe. But I understand the art world as a pattern or a network of people who are doing what they're doing at a certain moment, and they don't agree, but they respect that serious work is being done in all quarters. The point at which I would check out of my job, or that you should check out on me, or whatever it is the point where suddenly everybody says, well, really we do understand each other, and the disagreements are clear, and there's no movement, and we're just going to do our job from here on out. And if that happens, then we have reached a really static point in this culture, which will be far worse than any of the sins that any one of us commits. It'll be a sign that America is really freezing up. That there are the outs and the ins, and they're the ones who can't talk and won't talk, and it's dead. And I just think that's not necessary, and it's not right. This is not the right moment for it. It may happen, but it's not the right moment for it now. If you have Thelma Golden at the Whitney, Lowry at the Met, Debbie Y at the Modern, and you can go across Gary Garrels at the San Francisco Museum, Kathy Hallbrecht at the Walker. You're talking about an incredible network of people who do not agree, but who recognize. And there's things going on. And there are other people I didn't mention, so if they're listening, just, they shouldn't take offense.
Do you have any assignments for us?
No.
No, there's been so much food for thought. Truly, truly, truly. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please help us by folding a few chairs. I appreciate it.
It's not open.
Thank you.
Yeah. I feel like a dodo.
No, you and you really worked.
Wow.
That was very good, thank you.
Interesting you're getting interviews of the wine. I do something in the 96 Street Wine Reader, which is like
long time no
artists
see.
come and I interview them on stage and they talk a little bit. And it's like
It's a series or just one?
It's a series, no. This year is Susan Rothenberg,